The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courtroom, the air seemed to freeze. This wasn't because she was intimidating, but because no one believed she could survive this trial. The prosecutor sneered, running his fingers over a stack of papers as if victory was already in his grasp. The judge, a man who had held the seat of power for 30 years, didn't even try to hide his contempt. "Do you really think you'll get away with violating the Hatch Act just because you know how to talk to the media?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Jasmine didn't answer. She simply stared at him with eyes as cold as steel, the eyes of someone who knew that the law didn't always stand for justice. And then, before dozens of cameras pointed at her, before the jury bench filled with bias, she slowly placed her own stack of papers on the table. No one knew that in just a few minutes, the one who would be destroyed in the eyes of the public wouldn't be Jasmine. It would be those who had dared to underestimate her. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound that you could hear the distinct sound of Jasmine Crockett's footsteps as she walked through the large doors, stepping into the cold, unforgiving space of justice. The overhead lights illuminated her tall, poised figure, casting a spotlight on her resilient presence. At just 27 years old, Jasmine stood there carrying an undeniable strength that commanded attention. Her hair was neatly tied at the back of her head, her sharp features accentuated by the steady gaze that radiated confidence and power. Yet, despite her outward composure, those around her could feel the rising tension within her. As Jasmine walked into the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed like the beat of a war drum, reverberating across the hardwood floors. Reporters around her began scribbling quickly, flipping through their notebooks, their cameras ready to snap. Television crews flicked on their cameras, flashes of light blinking continuously. The atmosphere was thick, charged with anticipation. No one could have predicted that the White House press secretary would stand in this very courtroom, facing a lawsuit that had captured the nation's attention. The reason? A violation of the Hatch Act. She was accused of using her position of power to defend President Trump in a political statement, an act that had invited heavy criticism for both her and the president. The entire country had their eyes on her, waiting to see if she would stand firm against the storm headed her way. All eyes were on her. The prosecutor, a man in a gray suit with pale skin, sneered at her as if he already knew the outcome. The judge, sitting with his gavel in hand, looked at her with a cold, doubtful expression. He understood that Jasmine Crockett was a threat to the system, but he also recognized that she was just the first pawn in this political game. The courtroom was already set on its conclusion. Jasmine would fail. It was just a matter of time. She walked past the long benches and carefully took her seat. Each movement she made, though subtle, carried an undeniable strength. Everyone could see she was in control, but she was restraining her emotions. She gently adjusted the hem of her jacket with one hand, her other hand resting on the table, her eyes unwavering. The room was packed, but the only sounds left were the clicking of keyboards, the soft turning of pens, and the occasional murmur from the back. Reporters were intently taking notes, knowing that this was a battle that, if Jasmine Crockett lost, the public would witness her and President Trump's public downfall. They would have sensational stories to tell, a shocking moment that would ripple across American politics. The Hatch Act, a law passed in 1939, prohibited government officials from using their positions to intervene in political campaigns. But in a world where Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram had become political weapons, could a law from a time before these platforms still hold up? Could the Hatch Act be used to indict a White House press secretary for making a political statement at a press conference? Everyone had their answer even before the trial began. They believed Jasmine would be the one to lose. But who could have known that this young woman would not bend? She sat there, calm and resolute, her eyes locked on the judge. She was waiting for the moment when she would turn the tables. It was a silence full of strategy. But why was Jasmine Crockett so quiet? What weapon would she use to stand up against a force trying to push her into a corner? How many in that courtroom had asked themselves this question? How would she stand firm against the storm about to break? No one knew. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It wasn't just the quiet that weighed heavily on the room, but the suffocating tension that seemed to hang in the air, as if the entire space was holding its breath. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she sat still, unmoving, under the harsh, unyielding gaze of the judge high above her, perched in his seat of power. The judge wielded his gavel as though it were an extension of his own arrogance. His eyes were sharp, focused, and unblinking, fixed squarely on Jasmine as if she were nothing more than a mere annoyance in his courtroom. And then, as if sensing her unwavering composure, he scoffed, a low, mocking sound that sent a ripple of disbelief through the room. It wasn't the laugh of someone who found humor in the situation, but the bitter chuckle of someone who had already written his verdict, believing the battle was over before it even began. He studied Jasmine like a predator eyeing its prey, his gaze cold and disdainful. In his mind, Jasmine Crockett was nothing more than a naive woman caught in a game far too big for her to understand. The political world was a chessboard, and she was just a pawn. "Do you honestly think," he sneered, his voice cutting through the room like a razor, "that you can avoid the consequences of violating the Hatch Act simply because of a few political allies? You can't escape the law, no matter how many powerful people you have standing behind you." His words lingered in the air like a weight that pressed down on Jasmine's chest. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even react. She just sat there, her eyes still fixed on him, unwavering, calm, and focused. She knew what he was trying to do, to provoke her, to break her down with his scorn and ridicule. But Jasmine was no stranger to this. She had been through far worse than this courtroom, and she wasn't about to let a man like him make her feel small. Behind her, the prosecutor, dressed in his cold gray suit, joined in the mockery. He let out a low chuckle, the sound dripping with smug confidence. His fingers slid through his hair, each movement deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. He didn't need to believe Jasmine would lose. He knew the system was stacked against her. The courtroom had already made up its mind. The judge had already made his decision. Jasmine was doomed. She was the weak link in this battle, and they were both prepared to tear her apart, piece by piece. The room buzzed with whispers as the audience, reporters, and even the gallery shifted in their seats. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of Jasmine's supposed humiliation. They had all heard the rumors, the stories, the endless gossip surrounding this trial. They had already made their judgment. The young woman, the press secretary for the White House, was just a footnote in a much larger political drama, and they all knew it was only a matter of time before she would fall from grace. Jasmine Crockett, standing there in the midst of the storm, felt the weight of the eyes upon her. She could sense the judgment, the expectation, and yet she refused to let it consume her. For a brief moment, as the laughter and whispers reverberated around her, it felt as though she was standing alone in that vast, oppressive space. But that was precisely the moment she drew her strength from, the stillness that lay beneath the chaos. She said nothing. Her silence only fueled the judge's arrogance. It was as if he took her lack of response as confirmation of his superiority. To him, this was the ultimate proof that she was out of her depth. He leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face as if to say, "I knew it all along. She's nothing, just a naive girl pretending to be powerful." With a slight tilt of his head, the judge let out another mocking chuckle, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. The sense of victory hung in the air like a foul stench. He believed Jasmine had no chance. No one in this courtroom did. She was just a player in a game she didn't even understand, and he had already decided how it would end. The courtroom seemed to freeze, held captive by a dense, suffocating silence. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still in her seat, her hand resting calmly on the table, her eyes never wavering from the judge and the prosecutor. It was as if every sound in the room had vanished, leaving only the faint thumping of her own heartbeat in her chest. The tension was palpable, like a tightening knot in the air, but no one could fathom why she chose to remain silent in these crucial moments. It was a silence full of calculation. She wasn't agitated. She wasn't reacting to the judge's or the prosecutor's mocking comments. She simply sat there, calm and still, like a hunter waiting for the prey to step into the trap. Everything had been set in motion, and now it was time for her to seize the moment. An unsettling sensation filled the room, like the calm before a storm. Something was about to happen, but no one could pinpoint exactly what. The judge had spoken, the prosecutor had made his accusations. Yet Jasmine sat there, unmoving, with no emotion on her face. Her silence became a test for everyone in the room. All eyes were on her, wondering why she wasn't reacting, why she wasn't defending herself against their attacks. As someone standing on the platform of justice, Jasmine Crockett was not someone easily silenced. She knew that if she reacted now, if she let herself be drawn into their game, they would have the perfect excuse to tear her down. She understood that her silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a carefully calculated strategy. It was a strategy not to hide her vulnerability, but to create a gap that she would fill at the right moment when everything was in place. The judge remained seated high above, a smirk still plastered on his face. He believed that Jasmine was afraid, that she couldn't handle the pressure of the trial. But what he didn't realize was that Jasmine's silence was the power behind her plan. She didn't need to speak when the truth stood firmly by her side. The prosecutor kept repeating his arguments, even turning to the court and declaring, "This is the moment to close this case." But Jasmine wasn't in a rush. She wasn't bothered. She was letting them fall into the trap they themselves had set. A sense of dread began to spread throughout the room, as if everyone in that courtroom knew that the next move was impossible to predict. Jasmine's gaze remained fixed on the judge, but it wasn't the gaze of someone fearful. It was the gaze of a person resolute and prepared to fight until the very end. Outside the courtroom, reporters scribbled frantically, whispering about her strange silence. The whole world seemed to be waiting for her to crumble, but Jasmine refused to let herself fall into that trap. She knew that her silence was the answer that no one in the room could explain. Just a few seconds more, just one gentle touch at the right moment, and everything would change. The prosecutor stood tall, his face wearing the smug expression of someone who believed the victory was already his. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, walking calmly to the center of the courtroom, his sharp gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett, who sat with perfect posture, unshaken. He knew he could win easily simply by pressing the charges, but what gave him the most confidence was his arrogance, the supreme self-assurance he carried with him. "Ms. Jasmine Crockett." The prosecutor's voice rang out, strong and cold, with no hesitation. "You have exploited your position to spread false information, violating a law that we all must respect. The Hatch Act is not just a statute. It is the foundation of fairness in our government." He paused for a moment, his eyes locking onto Jasmine's as if searching for fear or at least some sign that she was beginning to waver. But there was nothing. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her hand gripping the documents tightly, her calm eyes never leaving the prosecutor, as if she were listening to a story that had nothing to do with her. Her golden hair was neatly tied back, and the dark blue blazer she wore exuded power, yet it carried no arrogance. The prosecutor didn't miss this detail. He looked at Jasmine with the gaze of a conqueror, a man who was certain that everything he said was irrefutable and nothing could alter the outcome. He continued droning on, repeating the charges, his tone dripping with contempt. "You publicly stated in a press conference, Canada is bowing down to our tax policies." He emphasized each word as though they carried monumental weight. That statement was not only false in its essence, but it also violated the Hatch Act, as you used your position of public authority to make a political statement, exploiting the power of the White House to influence the elections. The prosecutor's eyes swept across the room, as if looking for agreement from the jury, from the reporters furiously scribbling notes. But once again, Jasmine's gaze remained unchanged. She didn't rebut, didn't promise to explain, or blame anyone. She simply sat there with an air of unshakable calm, as if nothing could move her. Her composure didn't stop the prosecutor. On the contrary, it made him more self-assured, as if her silence was an acknowledgement of her defeat. He paced back and forth, feeling the strength in his accusations, and began to control the atmosphere. "But you didn't make just one mistake. You did this repeatedly, from negotiations with Hamas to reforms at the Pentagon, a clear pattern of actions using your political power to manipulate public opinion." Each word he spoke was like a blow to Jasmine's heart, but she didn't flinch. Her silence was calculated. She sat still, unreactive, but her grip on the documents tightened. In the prosecutor's eyes, Jasmine was a helpless prey, unaware of her impending capture. He continued, not realizing that her silence was creating a pressure no one could see. "This is an unethical action by a public official, an abuse of power so disgraceful that we cannot allow it to stand. No one is above the law. No one can escape responsibility." And then he stopped. The name Jasmine Crockett slipped from his mouth with contempt, as if confirming that she would never escape these charges. The prosecutor looked around, his chest swelling with the sense of victory he believed was inevitable. But amid the crowd, the hurried scribbling of pens, the flashes of cameras, and the curious gazes from the jury, a subtle change began to stir within Jasmine. She stared intently at the documents before her, her eyes sharp and unwavering. While the prosecutor continued to drag her down, she was already preparing to turn everything he had just said on its head. Not now, but soon. Jasmine needed only the perfect moment. This was the moment when Jasmine Crockett would prove that she was not the one being humiliated. She was not a pawn in the political game they wanted to set up. She was the one who would determine her own fate. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The prosecutor, having unleashed a barrage of heavy accusations, now stood still, his eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett as though he had already won. The whispers around the room began to grow louder, but Jasmine remained seated, her expression unreadable. Her grip on the documents tightened, but she showed no sign of panic. Her gaze remained locked on the judge sitting high in his powerful seat, his face stern and unwavering. At this moment, she wasn't just facing the prosecutor. She was up against the system itself, a system she knew all too well to be flawed, outdated, and incapable of addressing the complex issues of the modern world, let alone applying outdated laws in today's fast-paced society. The Hatch Act, a law passed in 1939, was the tool the prosecutor had tried to use to indict Jasmine. But was it still relevant when society had changed so drastically? Jasmine Crockett was not one to accept defeat easily. She sat in silence for a long moment, not because she didn't know how to respond, but because she was carefully calculating her next move. Her eyes were sharp, unwavering, like a cautious warrior waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Finally, when the prosecutor had walked back to his seat, his self-assured smile still lingering on his lips, Jasmine slowly stood up. She didn't rush. There was no obvious tension, but instead a terrifying stillness, as if she had already controlled every part of this moment from the start. The light in the courtroom seemed to shine down on her, illuminating her as a warrior of intellect, not someone who would be defeated, but someone ready to confront the arrogance around her. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she began flipping through the pages of the documents in front of her. Each page she turned was a step in her preparation, as if she were building each wall of her attack. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't impatient. Then, suddenly, her voice broke the silence, calm yet powerful. I do not deny that the Hatch Act is an important law for this country, but is it still capable of addressing the issues we face today? The courtroom fell into silence. The prosecutor, still wearing his smug expression, furrowed his brow, unable to understand what Jasmine was saying. He didn't know that she had prepared for this moment meticulously. The Hatch Act, sir, was enacted in 1939. That was a time when there were no social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, or TikTok. There were no online political events, no debates that ran all night on these platforms. It is entirely unfit for our time, where information is disseminated at an unprecedented speed. Jasmine's eyes remained fixed on the prosecutor. She continued flipping through the pages, her tone unchanged, but each sentence grew stronger. This law prohibits government officials from using their positions to interfere with elections, but it says nothing about the social media platforms we use daily. These regulations might have been appropriate in the past, but they cannot apply to the 4.0 era. Why? Because they are no longer powerful enough to regulate the behavior of those who wield media power without relying on direct political campaigns. The prosecutor's brow furrowed, and it seemed that he was starting to feel the shift in the room. What Jasmine was saying wasn't a weak defense, but a well-reasoned argument, an undeniable truth. Yet he wasn't ready to accept it. Jasmine Crockett turned to look at the judge, her gaze sharp as a blade. This is the era where information spreads through millions of tweets, through live posts, where a political statement can quickly make a huge impact without going through the election process. So, can the Hatch Act really be applied to what I said? She asked pointedly. A chill swept through the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, and a few nodded slightly, as if they were beginning to understand something. The reporters who had been observing from the sidelines started taking notes faster. It was a powerful expose that no one had seen coming. Jasmine didn't stop there. She flipped another page of the documents, and then her voice rang out again, stronger and undeniable. If you say I violated the Hatch Act, then you must prove that my words interfered with the election. But if it was just one statement in a press conference describing President Trump's policy, does that really violate the law you've created? You are the ones who failed to adapt to the new reality. This law is not enough to apply to the current conditions. The prosecutor stared at her, his face now showing clear signs of confusion. He hadn't prepared for this counterattack. All his arguments suddenly felt hollow as Jasmine pointed out that the legal system itself was outdated. He couldn't handle the theoretical battle Jasmine was leading. The silence in the courtroom grew thick, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move from the judge or from the prosecutor. Jasmine had just turned the tables, and no one knew that she had positioned herself for victory. The atmosphere in the courtroom had never been more intense. Jasmine Crockett remained as composed as ever, but the shift in the air around her was undeniable. The light from the overhead lamp seemed to cast a strange halo around her, making every movement of hers stand out more than before. She was not someone trying to avoid or dodge the accusations. She was standing tall, facing the world head-on. While the prosecutor remained standing, trying to justify his accusations with his usual bravado, Jasmine sat back down, gently placing the stack of documents on the table. There was no rush, no sense of urgency in her movements. It was her calmness that began to create an undeniable pressure on everyone present. The discomfort started to show on the prosecutor's face, and the judge couldn't ignore the fact that something was shifting in the room. The audience in the courtroom, who had originally seen Jasmine Crockett as nothing more than a weak pawn in the power game of big men, now felt a change in their own attitudes. They had believed she would not stand strong, that she would soon collapse under the weight of the system. But now they felt a shift in their perception, a growing doubt about everything they had previously believed. The eyes of a few reporters began to shift. They no longer focused solely on the prosecutor. They looked at Jasmine, sensing that her calm demeanor was carrying a message far stronger than anything they had heard before. The jurors no longer kept their faces cold and impassive. They began to glance at each other, exchanging looks as if they had just realized something they had never considered. Jasmine Crockett was not weak. She wasn't merely standing at the podium to be criticized, she was challenging the system itself. The prosecutor, now beginning to feel uneasy, tried to maintain his arrogant tone, but his gaze started to shift nervously. The confidence he had displayed earlier was now cracked. Every time he looked at Jasmine, she met his gaze with a coldness that seemed to tell him nothing could shake her. He started to doubt himself, wondering if he had been too hasty, too self-assured. The judge, who had previously mocked Jasmine, could no longer maintain his earlier arrogance. His gaze was beginning to shift. He was no longer the unwavering, authoritative figure looking down on the courtroom with unshakable certainty. Instead, he was starting to feel the need to reconsider his own assumptions. Though he would never admit it, he could not escape the feeling that Jasmine Crockett was presenting arguments that were sound and well-founded. A slow but clear change occurred. The eyes of the jurors no longer looked at her with pity or disdain. They began to look at her with expectation, as if waiting to hear what she would say next. The people in the gallery, who had been passive observers before, now watched intently, their eyes following every move Jasmine made. Their looks had shifted from doubt to admiration. The reporters, who had previously only been jotting down the prosecutor's accusations, now began to take note of the strengths in Jasmine Crockett's defense. A few of them began to form new headlines in their minds. Could she really pull off a victory? Is this the first turning point of the trial, or just another media manipulation? Questions began to form in their minds. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, silent but undaunted. It was her calculated silence that made the air feel suffocating. The sense that she was now in control of the situation was growing clearer by the second. She didn't need to speak excessively to prove she was right, because every eye in the courtroom was slowly but surely turning toward her, as though they had started to understand that what she was saying wasn't just political gamesmanship. It was a call for true justice. She's not just a spokesperson, she's someone demanding fairness. One of the jurors, an older woman, thought to herself, her gaze now clearly filled with admiration. And at that moment, Jasmine Crockett knew she had done something important, not with words, but with her silence and unyielding resolve. In every step she took, she had made everyone in that room reconsider how they saw her. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point, as if a ticking time bomb was about to explode. Every eye in the room, from the jurors to the prosecutor to the judge, was locked on Jasmine Crockett, the woman sitting steadfastly in the face of severe accusations. The prosecutor stood there, still wearing his smug expression, as though he controlled everything. But Jasmine knew this was the golden moment to strike back. Unlike before, when she had remained silent, Jasmine Crockett now began to meticulously break down each piece of evidence. Each detail the prosecutor had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. Every step she took in this journey felt like a powerful blow to the legal system, a system that had long been considered impenetrable. She wasn't just defending herself, she was delivering a strong message about the obsolescence of the system. Slowly, Jasmine rose from her seat. She wasn't rushing, but each of her movements carried the weight of unwavering determination. She picked up the stack of documents on the table and raised them before the judge, calmly flipping through the pages. The prosecutor eyed her with contempt, but Jasmine showed no sign of retreat. She began to read aloud what the prosecutor had overlooked, things he didn't want anyone to know. "You say I violated the Hatch Act, but you forgot that this law was enacted in 1939, a time when social media didn't even exist, when Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok were entirely unheard of. Do you understand that today's media platforms are completely different from the era when this law was created?" Each word she spoke felt like a blow to the prosecutor's pride. He began to feel uneasy, yet he still tried to maintain his calm demeanor. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stopping there. "I can easily demonstrate that the Hatch Act cannot be applied to today's media landscape, especially with platforms like Twitter and TikTok, where each statement, each remark, can go viral instantly, potentially having a widespread political impact without ever going through any election campaigns." She continued, posing each question like a sharp arrow piercing the outdated nature of the legal system. "Is it truly in the 21st century that we will still apply laws written in the previous century to regulate today's societal issues? Are my remarks on Twitter really violations of the law when it wasn't a part of an election, but simply a matter of national policy?" The prosecutor said nothing, but his gaze began to waver. Jasmine Crockett scanned the courtroom, where the jurors began to exchange glances, their skepticism replaced by a flicker of understanding. She continued flipping through the documents, pointing out clauses the prosecutor had neglected or failed to mention. The Hatch Act, as you know, was only applicable in a different era. It did not take into account the rise of social media platforms, where a political statement can be made not to interfere with an election but to clarify national policy. She paused for a moment, her eyes sharp as they swept over the faces in the room. "Prosecutor, you haven't done your homework. You don't realize that my words were not just political expressions, but an explanation of those policies to the public." Each word she spoke was a solid brick in her defense, not just based on logic, but with undeniable evidence. She turned another page, where an important clause was highlighted. "As you can see here, in the most recent amendments to the Hatch Act, there are no provisions for dealing with political statements through online platforms. That's why these charges have no foundation." The prosecutor tried to interrupt her, but it was too late. Jasmine Crockett had led everyone in the room to points they had never considered. She dismantled every argument the prosecutor had put forth, and when she saw the look of confusion on his face, she knew she had won. The tension in the courtroom continued to rise. The light from the overhead lamps now illuminated not just her face, but the truth she had just exposed. The air felt suffocating, as though everyone in the room knew that from now on, they would have to face a very different reality. Like a crashing wave, the shift in the atmosphere began to spread across the courtroom. The palpable sense of suspense and tension rose noticeably as everyone realized that Jasmine Crockett was now completely dominating the space. Every word she spoke not only countered the prosecutor's accusations, but also exposed the weaknesses within the legal system, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore the monumental change unfolding before them. The prosecutor stood opposite her, trying to maintain a calm expression, but this only made his growing discomfort more apparent to everyone. He had not expected to be caught off guard like this. Each of Jasmine's responses didn't just reveal flaws in his argument. It felt like a cold splash of reality, shattering the confidence he had worked so hard to build throughout the trial. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his fist tightening slightly, as if trying to control the anger and anxiety building inside him. He couldn't afford to let anyone see his vulnerability. Jasmine's words had unsettled him so much that he couldn't respond immediately. But instead of standing still and allowing the silence to persist, he rushed back to his papers, flipping through them frantically, as if searching for a new piece of evidence that could salvage the situation. "You can cite amendments to the Hatch Act all you want," the prosecutor said, trying to regain his composure, but his voice no longer held the same assurance. He glanced at the judge, his eyes betraying a visible unease. But this isn't an argument that you can use to escape these charges. Each of his words now seemed hollow, as the certainty in Jasmine's speech overshadowed everything he said. He felt as though he was losing control, like everything around him was starting to unravel. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, his gaze no longer shining with confidence, but filled with confusion and hesitation. He knew that their focus was no longer entirely on him. It was now fixed on Jasmine. They weren't just hearing her speak. They were starting to grasp the truth she was so sharply and clearly presenting. He couldn't deny that he was losing this battle. The prosecutor's eyes scanned the room, taking in every tiny reaction from the audience, from the reporters quickly scribbling notes to the jurors exchanging serious glances with each other. His breathing began to quicken. He felt like he was being cornered with no way out. His arrogance was gone. 1 second passed, then another. The prosecutor tried to breathe deeply, but Jasmine kept up the pressure. So, according to you, can my statement really be considered a political act? She asked again, shattering the thoughts in his mind. I was simply discussing policy, not elections. Don't twist the truth. The prosecutor gripped his documents tightly, his eyes filled with fear as he realized that everything was slipping out of his control. He rushed to repeat his arguments, but his words now seemed like an endless loop, devoid of conviction. What he said no longer had any persuasive power. He felt trapped in a losing battle, unable to fight back as Jasmine Crockett systematically dismantled every argument he had built. The judge's gaze, once filled with disdain, was now serious and intent. He was no longer the dismissive figure he had been earlier. He was listening intently to Jasmine, as though reconsidering everything the prosecutor had presented and questioning whether these charges were truly solid. The prosecutor, once the confident figure, was now the one floundering, while Jasmine was the one in control. The prosecutor's reaction had shifted from full confidence to utter confusion, and it was evident to everyone in the room. The entire atmosphere was thick with tension, as it became clear that it was no longer the prosecutor, but Jasmine Crockett, who was dominating every moment of the trial. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift in a way the prosecutor could not have anticipated. Jasmine Crockett stood there, not just refuting each of the prosecutor's accusations, but turning the tables in a way no one expected. She wasn't just defending herself. She was attacking the very system the prosecutor was trying to protect. All eyes were now on her, and no one dared to breathe too loudly, as though they were witnessing a final, decisive showdown. Jasmine stared directly at the prosecutor, her eyes sharp, and the light in the room seemed to highlight her face, making her even more determined and resolute. She wasn't just stating the truth. She was turning the weaknesses of her opponent into weapons she could use against him. You say I violated the Hatch Act, and you claim I used my position to intervene in politics. But what have you overlooked? Jasmine said, her voice low but full of weight. You haven't realized that it is the Hatch Act itself being used to unfairly attack me. Her words were a direct hit to the prosecutor's self-confidence. He had thought he had broken down all of Jasmine's arguments, but now he realized he had lost control. Jasmine continued, unrelenting. The Hatch Act, if we look at it carefully, was not designed to attack individuals. It was meant to protect fairness in politics. But now, you are using it as a tool to silence a White House spokesperson. A law designed to prevent the abuse of political power has become a tool to undermine those who disagree with your policies. The prosecutor's eyes began to flicker with confusion. He couldn't respond to Jasmine's sharp accusations, especially as she pointed out that it was he, not she, who was manipulating the law for political purposes. The disdain he had once directed at Jasmine was now replaced by an unmistakable unease. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence. Jasmine looked straight at the judge, no sign of fear or nervousness on her face, and continued, Judge, I ask you to reconsider all the evidence the prosecutor has ignored. They not only overlooked the truth, but also misapplied the Hatch Act. They failed to recognize that my remarks were simply an explanation of policy, not an intervention in an election. This law does not apply to modern media platforms, and you cannot allow the prosecutor to use it as a tool to attack an individual who disagrees with their politics. The judge, who had maintained a cold demeanor up until now, began to furrow his brow. The challenge in Jasmine's words made him reconsider everything. Could she be right? Were the prosecutor's arguments really solid, or was he simply trying to use the law to defeat her politically? The prosecutor's once confident expression now seemed to waver. He was still trying to maintain his composure, but his nervousness was becoming clear. Jasmine wasn't just pointing out contradictions in the Hatch Act. She was exposing the injustice in how the prosecutor was using it against her. Jasmine Crockett paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in for everyone in the room. She wasn't just facing the prosecutor. She was facing the entire legal system that the prosecutor represented. But her calmness was her most powerful weapon. She didn't need to raise her voice or display emotion. She simply needed the truth and sharp reasoning to shift the momentum. Jasmine turned back to the judge, her question soft yet heavy with significance. Do you believe the Hatch Act is still relevant to the world we live in today? Do you think this law can apply to people like me, those who use social media to communicate public policy? The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge appeared lost in Jasmine's questions. He began to sift through the documents before him, his hand gripping the gavel but no longer tapping it confidently. Jasmine had done what few could. She hadn't just refuted the charges. She had provided compelling reasons why the Hatch Act could not apply to the present situation. I ask you to reconsider this entire case, Jasmine concluded, her voice firm, unshaken, because it's not just me, but this entire system that is being exploited to serve political purposes. The courtroom descended into a tense silence. As Jasmine Crockett concluded her sharp defense, she had not only defended herself, but had also presented irrefutable legal arguments. The light in the room seemed to shine on her face, highlighting the determination and confidence she exuded. The feeling of victory hung in the air, and the audience, the reporters, and the jury all sensed that Jasmine Crockett had seized the initiative. But just moments later, the prosecutor stood up with a solemn air, his face no longer carrying the smugness it had before. Instead, there was an expression of coldness, even a hint of tension. He held up a new stack of documents, his eyes never leaving Jasmine. Miss Crockett, his voice rang out strongly, yet there was a trace of hesitation. We have new evidence, and I believe this will be the final piece to prove that you have committed a crime. He pulled a recording from the pile of documents and handed it to the judge. This is an audio recording from your press conference, which we believe proves you made serious offensive remarks about this country. Each word from the prosecutor felt like a sharp blade cutting through the tense atmosphere in the room. Jasmine showed no signs of panic. She remained seated, her gaze unwavering, but inside, a storm was brewing. This was the key evidence the prosecutor believed would turn the tide, and everything could change in an instant. We have reason to believe that what is recorded here is authentic, clearly showing your disrespect for this nation. The prosecutor continued, his eyes gleaming with pride. He paused for a moment, ensuring everyone had heard him. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She stood up slowly, gripping the documents firmly in her hand, her sharp eyes locked on the prosecutor. She stared at the audio recording he had just presented, but did not rush to react. You say this is evidence, but are you sure? Jasmine asked, her voice cold and confident. Are you certain this is an unaltered recording? I demand that its authenticity be verified immediately. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye now focused on Jasmine. The prosecutor, who thought he had just secured the decisive evidence, began to waver. He had never anticipated that Jasmine Crockett would respond like this. His confidence began to crumble in the face of her strong demands. Jasmine didn't just deny what the prosecutor had presented. She was now requesting the verification of the recording's authenticity, something the prosecutor had never even considered. This recording could easily have been edited or tampered with, Jasmine continued. And I don't believe anything you've presented without proving its authenticity. I request that the judge allow us to verify this recording immediately and determine whether it is the original. The judge looked at Jasmine, then at the prosecutor, as if weighing a significant decision. The prosecutor could not hide his growing anxiety. He stammered, "This is legitimate evidence. It's." But Jasmine immediately cut him off, not giving him a chance to justify himself. Legitimate or not, you must prove that, she said, her eyes still fixed on the prosecutor. I demand that this recording be verified immediately. If it's genuine, it must be validated as evidence. But if not, it's just a dirty game you're playing. The prosecutor, once so confident and even arrogant, now appeared lost, not knowing what to do. Jasmine Crockett had exposed the gap in his strategy. She was demanding verification, and now it was undeniable that the prosecutor might be using false evidence to tarnish her reputation. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke up. "Prosecutor, I request that you provide all the information and evidence regarding the authenticity of this recording." The prosecutor fell silent, his face twisted in confusion and panic. He hadn't expected that a simple demand from Jasmine Crockett would completely turn the tables. The entire courtroom now recognized the monumental shift that had just occurred. With each of her well-reasoned words and her confidence, Jasmine had not only shattered the prosecutor's arguments, but she had also cast doubt on the legality of the evidence the prosecutor had presented. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with tension, as though everyone was holding their breath. After Jasmine's incisive questioning of the audio recording's authenticity, the prosecutor found himself unable to respond confidently. The air in the room grew heavier with every passing second, as if everyone was waiting for Jasmine's next decisive move. The prosecutor tried to stand firm, but Jasmine's words had struck deep into the strategy he had so carefully built throughout the trial. He couldn't let everything crumble right before his eyes. After all, he had thought he had secured the victory when he presented the evidence he believed would crush her. But Jasmine, the one he had considered an easy target, wasn't backing down. She stood tall, her calmness acting as an unbreakable shield, facing both the prosecutor's attacks and the weight of the entire system. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She stood still, her gaze locked on the prosecutor and the others in the courtroom, allowing the moment to settle into everyone's consciousness. All eyes slowly shifted back to her. Everything seemed to pause. She didn't need to speak right away. Her silence was enough to convey that this was the pivotal moment. The prosecutor took a step back, his feet now seemingly unsteady. He glanced at the judge, his expression clearly showing signs of worry. It was only then that Jasmine spoke, softly but with unshakable conviction. "Mr. Prosecutor, you've presented an audio recording, but I demand that you prove its authenticity. The authenticity is the very thing you lack, and I will not accept evidence that could have been tampered with." The prosecutor blinked, unable to deny that Jasmine had exposed the weakness of the evidence he had presented. "Judge," Jasmine turned to the judge, her gaze sharp and decisive. "I demand an immediate examination of the metadata of this recording. If you cannot prove that it is the original, I request that it be excluded from the case." The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. All eyes now focused on the prosecutor, who was struggling to maintain his composure, but he couldn't hide the wavering in his eyes. He couldn't deny that Jasmine's arguments were sound, and now she wasn't just questioning the evidence, but raising a significant issue about its legality and origin. "The Hatch Act has been used to unjustly accuse me," Jasmine continued, fearless. "And now you're deliberately using unverified evidence to disgrace me. I demand that you prove it." The prosecutor lowered his head, as though his confidence and momentum had been stripped away. His hands trembled as he grasped the stack of documents, unsure of how to proceed. Jasmine Crockett was not someone he could easily back into a corner. She had completely shattered his arguments, and now she was exposing the fraud in the very evidence he had relied upon. "You cannot present evidence without proving its authenticity," Jasmine added, her voice clear, without a trace of concession. "And if you cannot prove the truth of this recording, I demand it be dismissed." The courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of tension. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing the fraud within the system the prosecutor was trying to protect. The judge's gaze shifted as well, no longer filled with disdain, but now with a serious and contemplative expression. He began to recognize that Jasmine was delivering a powerful blow to a system they hadn't even considered. Jasmine turned to face the prosecutor once more, unwavering, her confidence and logic evident in every word she spoke. "Nothing is certain until everything is checked and proven clearly," she concluded. The courtroom fell into a stifling silence. But one thing was clear: Jasmine Crockett had seized control. After demanding the verification of the audio recording's authenticity, she had not only highlighted the prosecutor's weakness, but also exposed how he had exploited the law to unfairly target her. All eyes in the room were on her, and she knew she had gained the trust of the jury and the audience. But the prosecutor, once confident in his strategy, could no longer remain seated. The pressure Jasmine had created in the courtroom had rattled him. He stood up, his hands trembling as he grabbed a stack of documents, quickly turning to face Jasmine. "You're trying to deceive this entire system," the prosecutor shouted, his voice shaking with fury. You can't deny that you made offensive remarks about this country. You're using tricks to deceive justice." Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. She stood tall, unfazed, staring at the prosecutor with eyes that seemed to have already anticipated his outburst. His angry words only made her stronger. "You're not the only one who can make accusations, prosecutor," Jasmine responded calmly, but her words struck with the force of a heavy blow to his wounded pride. "You must prove the truth, not turn this into a political game." He could no longer bear it. The anger and confusion boiled over, and he lost control. The prosecutor snapped, his voice rising in rage. "You can't keep doing this. This isn't a game. This is a courtroom, not a place for your political games. You've insulted this country, and I won't let you escape this charge." His words came like a wave of fury, but what the prosecutor failed to realize was that the more he resisted, the more his weaknesses became clear. He was unraveling in front of everyone, while Jasmine, with each word she spoke, pushed him further into a defensive corner. The jurors began exchanging looks, their gazes shifting. Before, they had listened to the prosecutor with a vague sense of doubt, but now they couldn't deny that Jasmine was presenting sharp evidence and exposing the flaws in the prosecutor's case. The reporters, who had been quickly jotting down the prosecutor's accusations, were now paying closer attention to Jasmine's rebuttals, as if they too had started to sense something was off with the case. The judge's gaze became more intense. Though he wasn't directly participating in the confrontation, his quiet scrutiny followed every development. He began to question the legitimacy of the entire case. "You can't just keep criticizing without clear evidence." Jasmine spoke again, her words decisive. "Prosecutor, you've wasted this court's time with baseless accusations. You need to prove your case, not stand there shouting." The prosecutor refused to stop, but his fury only seemed to increase the discomfort in the room. His eyes began to waver. Each word Jasmine spoke was a blow to his arrogance. His resistance not only crumbled his arguments, but also diminished any support he still had from those watching the case unfold. "This is the truth, prosecutor," Jasmine said without mercy. "If you cannot prove that this recording is the original, I demand that you immediately withdraw all charges." While the prosecutor stubbornly continued to argue, the jury and the audience began to recognize that Jasmine Crockett was in control of the game. They no longer saw her as an easy target. Instead, they saw a person standing firm, facing every pressure head-on. The prosecutor's fury couldn't make Jasmine waver. In fact, it only made her seem stronger. The eyes of the prosecutor, once filled with arrogance, were now filled with confusion and fear. Jasmine Crockett, with her intelligence, calmness, and poise, had proven that no one could easily bring her down. The courtroom was shrouded in an oppressive silence, as if the air itself had frozen. Every eye was fixed on Jasmine Crockett, who was not only facing a defeated prosecutor, but also a legal system full of gaps and injustices. After a series of furious rebuttals from the prosecutor, he now stood silent, with no words left to speak. Jasmine had not only demolished every argument the prosecutor had built, but she had also clarified the reason and justification behind her own stance. The prosecutor's once smug gaze had now faded. He stood there, clutching his papers, unable to counter anything Jasmine had presented. She didn't need to speak again, but she was about to take a crucial step in this story. This was the decisive moment, not just for the prosecutor, but for the entire case. Jasmine Crockett stood up, gently adjusting the papers on her desk. She didn't appear rushed. Each of her actions seemed calculated, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Her bright and resolute eyes scanned the room, from the prosecutor to the judge to the jury and reporters. "Prosecutor, you've tried to deceive the court with vague accusations and unsubstantiated evidence," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But now, I want you and everyone in this room to understand that the Hatch Act cannot and should not be applied in the current social and political context." Jasmine's words were not filled with hatred or vengeance, but were instead a carefully crafted strategy, calm, logical, and persuasive. She wasn't shouting or cursing. She was simply stating the truth, a truth no one in the room could deny. The Hatch Act was enacted in 1939, Jasmine continued. At that time, there was no social media, no Twitter, Facebook, or TikTok. We didn't have a world where the public could connect and communicate within seconds. Today, when every statement can become global news in minutes, Can the Hatch Act still apply to a rapidly changing and evolving society? The courtroom fell silent. The jurors began to reconsider. They were no longer just listening to her words. They were feeling the weight of her arguments. They began to understand that the Hatch Act could not be applied to today's world, where social media and the public can create political shifts in an instant. Jasmine Crockett had presented an unassailable argument. We live in a world where information is no longer controlled the way the Hatch Act intended, Jasmine continued. And if we continue to apply outdated laws like this, we will live in an unjust world where people like me are punished for speaking the truth simply because our words don't align with those in power. The prosecutor stood motionless, unable to respond. He couldn't defend his accusations because Jasmine had exposed a truth he couldn't deny. The judge's gaze had lost its previous arrogance. He began to consider every point raised carefully, as he knew that Jasmine Crockett was not only presenting logical arguments to defend herself, but also questioning the validity of the Hatch Act in today's society. The jury exchanged serious, focused glances. They were no longer hearing this case through old perspectives. Jasmine had opened a new door, one where fairness was prioritized, and no one could overlook the sharp reasoning she had laid out. Jasmine Crockett paused for a moment, staring at the prosecutor without needing to say anything further. "Do you wish to continue?" she asked, her voice devoid of force but filled with cold, undeniable power. This question was not merely a challenge, but an affirmation that she had regained control of the entire trial. The courtroom was once again enveloped in a heavy silence, as if time itself had stopped. Jasmine Crockett had not only shattered every argument the prosecutor had put forward, but she had also made it clear to everyone in the room that she was not just a White House spokesperson. She was a formidable legal warrior with a deep understanding of the law. She didn't fade into the background. Instead, she grew even more luminous in this confrontation. Jasmine Crockett looked at everyone in the room, her eyes unwavering and sharp, just as they had been from the very beginning. The prosecutor stood there, gripping his stack of documents, but his face was now filled with confusion and doubt. She had thrown him off balance, and now it was time for Jasmine to end this battle. She turned toward the judge, making sure no one would forget that she was the one in control of this trial. "I want the judge and everyone in this room to consider a very important legal precedent," Jasmine said, her voice calm but powerful, forcing everyone to listen intently to every word she spoke. That would be the case of Jenkins versus State Department. A collective shiver ran through the courtroom. Her words were like arrows aimed at the prosecutor's smugness, and they raised an unsettling discomfort within him. Jasmine had not only dismantled his arguments, but now she was introducing a powerful legal weapon to end this battle. Jenkins versus State Department, she continued, is a landmark case in which the court ruled that if laws do not include provisions to address technological advancements and the realities of modern society, they cannot be applied to new circumstances. And this is exactly why the Hatch Act cannot apply to today's political and social context. The prosecutor, who had thought he had secured the victory with the Hatch Act, now found himself unable to refute Jasmine's sharp logic. She continued, undaunted, "And that's what you've overlooked, prosecutor. Just like in Jenkins, no new laws have been passed to address the social media issues that I'm facing. The current administration operates in a world where social media and online platforms dominate everything. And the Hatch Act, while well-intentioned in 1939, cannot regulate the rapid changes we're witnessing today." The courtroom once again fell into complete silence. The jury's gaze began to shift, no longer doubting Jasmine's persuasiveness. She wasn't just stating the truth. She was exposing the legal flaws and making everyone realize that the prosecutor had failed to apply the law appropriately. No law can be applied if it hasn't been updated to reflect the modern world, Jasmine continued. "And I ask you, Judge, to reconsider all the provisions of the Hatch Act and their place in today's political context. Without clear legal amendments, we cannot use it to apply to my case." The judge did not respond immediately. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. The prosecutor's unease became obvious. He could no longer refute this legal weapon. Jenkins versus State Department was a critical decision that everyone would have to acknowledge. Jasmine locked eyes with the judge, her gaze firm, and the judge could not ignore the truth she had uncovered. He began to flip through the documents, reading each section carefully, and a visible change began to appear in his expression. He could no longer deny that Jasmine was right. There had been no new legislation passed to address current issues, and the Hatch Act was no longer applicable in today's political climate. This law cannot be used to apply to your case. The judge finally spoke, but his tone was no longer mocking. It was serious and respectful. I will instruct all parties involved to reconsider this matter. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor stood there, unable to refute anything Jasmine Crockett had presented. Each word she spoke was not just a rebuttal, but a powerful strike against the flaws the prosecutor and the legal system were trying to uphold. Her every statement was a sharp cut, slowly dismantling the prosecutor's arrogance and turning the tide in her favor. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained silent, but the buildup of tension had reached its breaking point. Jasmine Crockett stood firm, unwavering, her gaze never leaving the prosecutor or the judge. Every eye in the room was on her, awaiting the final persuasive words of her defense. With unshakable calm, Jasmine stood tall, her hands naturally placed on the table but emanating a quiet authority. We cannot live in a society where outdated laws continue to be abused, Jasmine began, her voice resonating with a powerful declaration. And I will not let that happen to me. The courtroom seemed to awaken with her words. The prosecutor stood there, unable to utter a word, staring at Jasmine, his once smug and confident demeanor now gone. Jasmine Crockett had completely stripped away his defenses, forcing him to face his own shortcomings. She wasn't just rejecting the accusations. She was challenging a legal system that was growing increasingly irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. The judge's gaze, once filled with contempt or impatience, had shifted. He began to realize that Jasmine wasn't only fighting for herself, but standing up for something larger: fairness and the integrity of the law. Quietly, he nodded, as if understanding that what Jasmine was saying wasn't just significant for her, but held broader implications for society and the legal system. Jasmine didn't stop there. She continued with strength and conviction. This system cannot keep applying outdated laws to the context of today's society. We cannot continue to live with laws that no longer fit the reality, laws that no longer protect true justice. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. And I will not allow myself to become a victim of this injustice. Every eye in the room no longer looked at Jasmine with doubt or disdain. They saw a strong woman, a true legal warrior, standing not just for herself, but for a principle of justice. The prosecutor, now with no words left, simply stood in silence, realizing his defeat. Every accusation he made, every piece of evidence he presented, lost its weight when faced with Jasmine's integrity and intellect. The atmosphere in the courtroom was now unmistakable. The jury and the audience could feel it. Jasmine had not only won this case, but she had also triumphed over a higher principle. The law must always align with justice, and outdated laws must never be used to perpetuate injustice. Jasmine Crockett stood there, confident, not a hint of fear in her demeanor, only a quiet strength and determination. She had done her part, not just defending herself, but defending what was right in this society. At this point, she was no longer just a spokesperson. She was a champion for a more just world. The courtroom was shrouded in silence, a heavy stillness that everyone in the room could feel as the air seemed to shift after the tense showdown between Jasmine Crockett and the prosecutor. Exhaustion seemed to fill the space. The prosecutor had been thoroughly defeated, unable to find the strength to refute Jasmine's sharp points. The judge, who had maintained an unwavering, almost disdainful attitude throughout the trial, now showed a stark change in his demeanor. He sat quietly, gripping the gavel, his eyes focused on Jasmine with a seriousness that was starkly different from his previous demeanor. There was no longer any trace of contempt, nor the mocking expressions he had shown earlier. His gaze now carried a hint of respect, as though he had come to the realization that Jasmine had been right all along. What Jasmine had presented was not just a defense of herself, but a keen dissection of the flaws within the current legal system. She had not only fought for her own freedom, but had stood up for justice in society. A sense of surprise rippled throughout the courtroom. From the jurors to the onlookers, everyone recognized the shift in the judge's attitude. A man they had once believed to be immovable now seemed to acknowledge that Jasmine was indeed right. Jasmine Crockett stood there, saying nothing, simply meeting the judge's gaze, as if she knew that everything had now changed. Every word she had spoken before now seemed like a series of strong steps that had led the judge to recognize the validity of her argument. Seconds later, the silence was shattered as the judge raised the gavel and declared, "After reviewing all the evidence and the arguments from both sides, I cannot deny that this case lacks a basis." The judge's words rang out like a thunderclap, leaving everyone in the courtroom stunned. Reporters, the jury, and the audience couldn't believe what they were hearing. The judge continued, "I hereby dismiss all charges against Jasmine Crockett. There is insufficient evidence to convict her. Therefore, this case is immediately dismissed." The courtroom erupted in disbelief. Those present couldn't process the outcome, especially after the long and tense moments they had witnessed. They had expected a lengthy trial, a battle that would stretch on until the very last minute. But now the judge had made an unbelievable pronouncement. Jasmine Crockett had won. The prosecutor, who had once been so confident that he would defeat her, now stood in silence, unable to say a word. He looked at the judge, but there was nothing he could say in opposition. He never imagined Jasmine could have defeated him so decisively. He could no longer deny that Jasmine had exposed the holes in the case, in the Hatch Act, and in the way the prosecutor had applied the law. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood there, calm and confident. She showed no signs of arrogance, only a quiet peace, knowing that she had done what was right. The sense of anticipation and shock continued to permeate the room as Jasmine Crockett stepped down from the stand. She didn't need to say anything more. Everyone understood she had won, not just in this trial, but in a much greater struggle, the struggle for justice and legal transparency. She had not only defended herself, but had delivered a powerful message about challenging outdated systems and upholding fairness. As she exited the courtroom, every eye was on her. The audience, the reporters, and the jury all saw her as a victor in this battle. She had not only defeated the prosecutor, but she had also defied the biases against a woman standing tall in a system fraught with challenges. Jasmine Crockett had not only won her case, but had also sent a powerful message about the courage to face a powerful system, about putting the truth above all else, and not allowing oneself to be crushed by authority. Every step she took out of the courtroom was a testament to her confidence, to the strength of someone who had won not just for herself, but for all who fight for justice. After walking out of the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett became more than just a winner in her trial. She had become a symbol of righteousness and change. Her story, marked by resilience, intelligence, and courage, quickly spread across the country, especially within political circles and among those who fight for justice. As soon as the news of her victory was announced, terms related to Jasmine began trending on social media, and within hours, millions of posts, videos, and comments were shared and spread. From her supporters to those who had criticized her, no one could deny that her victory was a pivotal moment in confronting outdated laws. Jasmine became a symbol not only in politics, but also in the broader struggle for a fair society. She was a model of someone who dared to stand up against the entrenched powers and outdated systems. Public admiration grew, and politicians everywhere couldn't help but acknowledge the impact she had made. Jasmine's eyes shone, not because she had won, but because she had marked a turning point for a generation. The momentum of her victory spread far and wide. But more importantly, Jasmine had succeeded in shifting the public's perception of an issue that could no longer be ignored: legal reform and the need to adapt laws to the modern age. She wasn't just a victor in this trial. She was the spark that ignited change for future generations. Though Jasmine's victory was monumental, she didn't stop there. She understood that the fight didn't end in the courtroom. She knew that true change couldn't come from just one trial, but required continuous struggle to protect the values she believed in. As a White House spokesperson, she not only had to face political attacks, but also proposed new policies that would protect citizens' rights. Jasmine continued her work, not to prove herself, but to push for the real change she longed for. She began focusing on efforts to reform outdated laws, particularly the Hatch Act, which she had proven was no longer relevant. She used her victory as a stepping stone to call for legal reforms nationwide. Under her leadership, a new political movement was born, one pushing for a change in how legal issues were approached in the modern age. However, she knew that change would not come easily. Jasmine understood that every day was a battle, and she was ready to continue fighting for what she believed in. We would not see Jasmine Crockett resting on her laurels after this victory. She would remain at the forefront of the journey to create a more just world. The day after her victory, Jasmine returned to her work as if it were a normal step following her monumental win. But the change in her was not just in her outward actions. It was in the spirit and ideals she carried with her. She was no longer a silent observer of major decisions, but had now become a trailblazer for the next generation. She understood that from now on, she wouldn't just be someone working behind the scenes. She would be the one lighting the way for those who dared to stand up for justice and truth. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a courtroom winner. She had opened a new door for the younger generation, those who were unafraid to fight for what was right, even when the system had outdated rules trying to hold them back. As she stepped out of the office, she took one last look at the path she had opened. She knew her journey was just beginning. Jasmine was not only a victorious litigant, she had become the symbol of change. And now, she was the one paving the way for a new generation, a generation that would not hesitate to stand for justice, challenge systems, and fight for what was right.